Hello, everybody. How are you all doing today? I hope you're all well. I hope you've had a nice weekend and that your week is going well so far. I'm very well. Looking forward to reading the next part of The Devil's Engine Hellraisers for you. So far, we've been introduced to two characters. One is called Marlowe. He has just been expelled from school for drawing something a little bit rude on his principal's car, or carving something into the paintwork of his principal's car. He's just been expelled from his, I think fourth school in the last few months, and he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know where he's going. He just keeps getting in more and more trouble. He calls himself a Hellraiser because he's always raising hell. And we've been introduced to Pan, who is a literal Hellraiser, who is running along with her team away from something very dangerous, and they've just rushed into an underground parking lot, being chased by demons, or about to be chased by demons. And and Marlowe has heard the explosion of this kind of ongoing battle, and he's kind of picked up a shotgun from the store where he was trying to buy some booze, and that's kind of where we left it last time. So I'm going to get through a couple of chapters today, and we'll see where we end up. Okay. Grab your cup of tea. Oh, I don't have a cup of tea. And enjoy. This chapter is called Do Your Worst. The world was coming apart. Literally. Pan propelled herself away from the truck, knowing that if she stayed still, she was finished. Not dead, but something infinitely worse. The air above her was sparking wildly, fingers of sulphurous white lightning ripping past close enough to burn her skin. The parking lot was a mess of fire and noise and smoke, and there was something up there in the darkness between the steel beams. Something that thrashed and squirmed. "I told you to stay in the truck," yelled Herc. He didn't wait for an answer. Pulling the trigger on his combat shotgun, the ceiling exploded into concrete dust. Forrest was there too, his shotgun clenched in one white-knuckled hand, but his bulging eyes fixed on his watch. Pan didn't have to see it to know that the display read 00000000. The demons were here. His time was up. Pan hefted her crossbow, scanning the space around her, everything drenched in red, liquid light from the glow sticks. Other than the truck, there were maybe half a dozen cars down here, 2 SUVs, a Corvette that had seen better days, and a... Halfway across the parking lot, she spotted a red Ford. Tongues of fire licked across the vehicle, fierce enough to shatter the windshield. One of the tyres hissed, then popped, the car bouncing. But Pan was looking at the hood, the way it seemed to be peeling away from the rest of the car. A thin strip of metal curled up, followed by another and another. Then the bulk of a body, like a camouflage spider, was finally revealing itself. It stretched, a living sculpture of red metal and engine parts. Then it ripped free from the rest of the car. "There!" Pan said. "Pan, wait!" yelled Herc behind her, his voice lost in the thunder of gunfire. She ignored him, sprinting towards the Ford. The creature pounced, landing on the floor with a crunch, its metal legs skittering. It stretched up to its full height, all 4 feet of it. The metal folded and refolded like it was paper, jaws opening and snapping shut, lined with scalpel-like teeth. It had no eyes. It didn't need them. It knew exactly where to find its prey. "Protect Forrest!" she yelled at Herc, but he was already by the boy's side, pumping another shell into his gun. The demon opened the bear trap of its mouth and shrieked, a noise that grated down her soul, making her want to curl into a ball and cry. Instead, she ran, flicking the safety off the crossbow. The demon moved too, its clumsy legs finding their form, picking up speed, demolishing the distance between them. 20 yards, 15, 5. It leaped, the force of it punching holes into the concrete floor. Pan pulled the trigger. The demon might have been made of steel, but the bolt that flashed from the bow was forged out of the heart of the engine itself. It slammed into the beast like a wrecking ball, stopping it dead. The creature crumpled to the ground, slashed at its own metal skin. It had time for one hellish scream before the bolt exploded like a grenade, sending both halves of the demon spinning across the car park. "Move!" yelled the driver, running her way. Both halves of the demon were wriggling, trying to reassemble themselves. The driver aimed his shotgun at the head end and fired, blasting it into metal splinters, filling the air with shrapnel. Its movements slowed, pieces of broken metal moving like jumping beans as they clung on to life. He fired twice more. Then, just like that, it was still. "Got to," he said. Then his mouth opened in horror, unleashing a scream that almost deafened her. By the time Pan had worked out what was going on, the driver was staggering back, his left foot missing. The floor where he had been standing had opened up like a mouth, barbs of concrete gnashing and grinding at the air, slick with his blood. The ground split as the new demon pulled itself free. Its body was a chunk of masonry, the white lines of the parking bay still etched over it. It tried to find its balance on 5 stunted concrete legs. Pan stepped back, jamming the crossbow on the floor in order to reload it. The weapon was powerful, but it was just about the most awkward thing Ostine could have given her. She wound the handle, yelling as she did, "Somebody shoot it!" The driver was on the floor now, jets of blood spraying from the stump of his leg, his eyes rolling back in their sockets. But Herc was there, jabbing the end of his shotgun against the bulk of the concrete demon and pulling the trigger. Pan threw up her hands, feeling shards of floor embed themselves in her face, the pain lost in the thunder of adrenaline. She finished winding the bow, fumbling for a bolt and jamming it into the gutter. Herc pumped, fired again, and the demon was gone, just a concrete shell left behind. Hang in, said Ostine through her earpiece, his words faint and in pieces. "They've already almost broken the contract. 5 minutes. Is that what he was saying? That was an eternity. She scanned the parking lot. The metal demon and the concrete one were both gone, and a pile of rubble by the side of the truck made it clear that Herc had finished off another. But the air was still full of sulphur. She could almost see that paper-thin line between this world and theirs, straining, the countless demons that teemed on the other side, all trying to break through, all trying to get to her. But where the hell was Forrest? Herc swore, pointing up the ramp. "Kid's doing a runner," he roared. "God damn it, Forrest." Oh, stupid. Really stupid. You couldn't run from them. There was nowhere to hide. Pan opened her mouth to call the boy's name, but it was too late. Something wrenched itself from the wall that formed the side of the ramp, a dog-like shape with concrete skin and a steel spine. Forrest never even saw it coming. It pounced onto his back, crushing the boy in a spray of blood and jelly. Even past the howl of the demon, Pan heard him scream, a rasping, desperate, haggard cry that echoed off the walls. "Turn away," something in Pan's head told her. "You don't want to see it." But she kept looking, seeing the floor beneath the dead boy grow soft, melting like licorice. The air began to shimmer, the way it does over a barbecue, and with a soft pop, Forrest's clothes ignited. The whole ramp was growing red, dissolving in the heat, but the dead kid was still howling, even as his hair caught fire, even as his skin bubbled. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Not even when she felt Herc's hands on her, trying to pull her around. The demon's head snapped forward like a viper's, and Forrest's head exploded, scraps of bone and brain skittering across the molten ground. But she could still hear those screams as the boy's twitching body started to sink into the ground. He'd be screaming for the rest of time. Forrest vanished slowly, as if he'd fallen into a tar pit. Then the demon crumpled to the floor, like its batteries had run out. Through the smoke and the haze, Pan watched the ground start to heal, cooling. Not for long, though. She looked at her watch. Less than a minute, and she'd be pulled under too, the fast track to hell. She felt Herc's hands on her again, pulling her close. "We'll do what we can, Pan," he said, his voice shaking like a leaf. I'll try." She shrugged him away. She didn't need his pity. She knew what she was getting into. You play the game, you take the pain. She checked her crossbow, choking on that gut-churning stench of sulphur seeping out between the cracks in reality. There was another smell too. She looked back at the Ford, seeing gasoline spurting from the ruptured tank, pooling around the tyres. She checked her watch. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It emitted a soft, chirping alarm. Somehow it didn't quite have the gravity she expected it to. An air raid klaxon would have been more appropriate. She lifted the crossbow, the whole thing shaking. Here they come. The wall! Herc yelled, and she followed the barrel of his gun to see a shape pull itself free from a pillar. This one was bigger, almost human-shaped, exploding outwards in a plume of dust. The whole parking lot groaned, cracks appearing in the ceiling, the weight of the building above threatening to crash down, bury them all alive. Herc lifted his gun and fired, the demon pushing through a hail of buckshot. It swiped a huge fist before Herc could reload, sending him flying. Pan fought her panic, lifting the crossbow and firing. The creature twisted at the last second, the bolt burying itself in the wall behind it. Pan swore, slamming down the crossbow and winding the handle. It pounced, its fingers gouging trenches in her armour, knocking the air from her lungs and the crossbow from her fingers. Herc appeared by her side, shoulder charging the demon, forcing it back. He raised his gun and fired again. Again. Each blast punching the demon across the parking lot. Too late, Pan noticed where they were heading. Herc, no! The demon slipped and fell into the puddle of gasoline from a car's ruptured fuel tank. Herc firing one last shot. The world went white, burning like a supernova, a silent explosion that lifted Pan up and hurled her backwards. By the time she'd hit the floor, the noise had caught up, a wave of rolling thunder that felt thick enough to drown him. She fought against the heat, against the boiling tide of smoke and vaporized blood, feeling like she was drowning. Okay, help, Pan. She tried to push herself up onto her elbows, her whole body made of pain. Everything was red, glowing, and she realised her eyes were closed. It seemed to take an age for her to remember how to open them. The parking lot was a lake of fire. Everything danced in the heat, nothing quite real. It was almost as if the fire was a living thing, lumbering towards her. Oh no. The burning demon was made up partly of a charred corpse, partly of something that might once have been a car seat. The whole thing was an inferno, but it wasn't slowing it down. These were demons, after all. Fire was like silk to them. It lurched through the wreckage, bounding right for her. Pan grunted, ignoring the agony as she lifted herself up. Her leg wasn't working properly, and when she looked down she saw a shard of bone poking from her shin. She stumbled, crunching against a pillar. Where the hell was the crossbow? The demon was halfway across the lot when another parked car exploded, the force of it lifting the Corvette up and crunching it against the ceiling. Pan ducked behind the pillar, feeling the fist of the shockwave buffet past her. She hobbled around, flanking the demon. There, a dozen yards away, her crossbow. She pushed herself away from the pillar, limping towards it, hearing the howl of the demon on her tail. She collapsed next to the weapon, swinging it around just as the creature was reaching for her. The wire twanged, and the bolt buried itself in the creature's eyeless face. It had time to grunt, almost like it couldn't believe its luck. Then it exploded into dust. A shotgun blast behind her, Herc calling out a word that might have been her name. Pan turned to see him limping her way, clouds of smoke billowing around him. His face was a mess, smeared with angry burns. She couldn't see what he was shooting at. The truck was in the way. At least part of the truck. Part of the truck that unfolded into a demon the size of a grizzly bear, which opened its mouth and roared. Pan swore, lifting the crossbow even though it wasn't loaded. One of the demon's long front legs curled around her chest. It squeezed and she heard a rib snap, a supernova of pain detonating inside her. The crossbow fell, clattering to the floor. Herc's gun roared again, the creature's head tinkling like a tuneless music box. Clouds of shot tore past her, stinging her skin. The demon didn't even seem to feel it, lifting another leg, angling its bladed foot in her direction. Its head was made up of part of the bumper and the license plate. Ski Utah. Serrated teeth still pushing themselves free of the metal. Even though it had no eyes, it seemed to look at her, and she knew exactly what it was thinking. Finally, after all these years, we can collect. She almost felt the relief of it, until she remembered what would happen next. Pan! Hurt cried out. Too far away, too slow. The creature squeezed again, her bones splintering. Pan closed her eyes, hoping it wouldn't be as bad as they told her, hoping that Ostein had been wrong when he'd said that she'd been begging for death if they ever caught her. She'd be begging for death for the rest of eternity. Go on then, she spat, half words, half blood. Do your worst. And it did. The next chapter is Coward's Way Out. First he was expelled, now the world was ending. Talk about a day from hell. Another dull explosion shook the bodega, hard enough to rattle Marlowe's bones. He grabbed a door handle, sucking in a lungful of hot, smoky air. The shotgun was heavy, threatening to slide out of his sweaty hand, and he gripped it hard enough to make his fingers ache. What was he doing? Sirens rose up over the echo of the explosion, wailing like mourners at a funeral. There was a smell in the air like nothing he'd ever experienced, something that was almost volcanic. He wondered if it actually was the end of the world out there, if he'd step out of the store to see lava running down the streets of Mariners Harbour. Staying here, though, wasn't an option. The rest of the ceiling was coming loose, threatening to crush him like it had crushed the cashier. He opened the door, squinting. There was no lava, but plenty of people, all of them panicking. A few looked his way, double taking when they saw the shotgun clenched in his hand. The guys hanging out in front of the store had scattered. He half thought about dropping the gun, but he had no idea what was going on out there. Could have been a terrorist attack or a full-on gang war, in which case he might need it. Not that he was planning on shooting anyone, but it might give him the time to run. The air outside was thick with smoke, tendrils that snaked into his lungs, choking him. He coughed them out as best he could, reaching for his inhaler with his free hand, sucking in a couple of blasts until the pressure on his chest loosened. Where was he? He didn't recognise any of the buildings, but every window in sight had been shattered. The explosions were coming from behind him, which meant the best way to move was forward. He jogged across the street, clutching the shotgun to his chest, hoping the thing wouldn't self-detonate and blow off his head. He'd only made it a few paces when he saw a shimmer of light up ahead, a cop car screeching around the corner. "Hey!" he yelled, then suddenly pictured himself charging down the street with a lethal weapon. Oh, great move, Marlowe. The cops around here shot first and asked questions never. He turned and bolted the other way, in the direction of the smoke and the thunder. Are you insane? All that mattered was not being caught. He was in enough trouble as it was. He was wheezing bad by the time he passed the store, seeing what looked like a hospital up ahead. There was a ramp for an underground parking lot, smoke churning out of it like an upturned waterfall. It rose into a sky that was too dark for this time of day, the sun just a greasy smudge. The air was full of something sharp, almost electric, that same charge that made his hair stand on end, which pricked his skin with goose flesh. A car engine behind him, revving hard. He glanced over his shoulder to see the cop car looming up. Another one was approaching from the right, a couple of hospital security guards to the left. He heard the squeal of tyres behind him and the pop of a car door being opened. Putting his head down, he went the only way he could, right towards the ramp. Whatever was going on down there, he might be able to find a way out. If they arrested him now, God knows what they'd charge him with. He ran, tripping over the soft ground, the weapon rattling in his grip. The cops were yelling, the guards pushing their way past the flocks of people in pastel scrubs and billowing hospital gowns that were scattering from the building. Marlowe ignored them, pushing forward into the darkness of the ramp and doing everything he could to catch his breath. He peeked down, seeing a whole lot of nothing through the smoke. Something was glowing there, though, like the heart of a volcano. Pop, pop, then a scream that didn't sound human, that sounded more like shredding metal. He tried to take a step, but his body wouldn't obey, locked tight in protest. Maybe he should just surrender to the police. Try to explain himself? Yeah, and what's the going rate for a weapons charge? How many years? He took as deep a breath as his crappy lungs would let him. Then he set off, propelling himself down the ramp. He ducked low, but the smoke still found him, clawing its way down his throat, as solid as a dead man's fingers. He coughed again and again, each time feeling like he was going to spit up a lung. The glowing embers up ahead grew brighter, and he saw the passage leading into the first level of the parking lot. It looked like it had been sculpted out of clay by a child, the floor covered in huge bumps, the ceiling drooping. The parking lot beyond was framed by fire, and through the shimmering haze he could see at least 2 cars blazing, the floor a lake of flame and the ceiling a storm of smoke. The bark of a gun rang out from somewhere in the chaos, startling him. He squinted into the flames. Was that somebody up there? A man dressed in black, his hair singed away. He was holding a rifle of some kind, or a shotgun maybe, firing it into the churning heat of one of the exploded cars. Marlowe raised his own gun, so much heavier than it had any right to be. Was this man one of the good guys or the bad guys? Should he pull the trigger now, cut him down? What if he called out and the guy turned around, shot back before Marlowe had a chance to defend himself? Marlowe had taken 6 steps into the garage when he heard a crunch behind him. He swung around to see something that had to be an illusion caused by the heat, that couldn't be real. The armoured truck that stood at the end of the ramp was coming to life. Literally coming to life. Something was pulling itself out of the vehicle, a shape made up of the wide grille and the licence plate. One of the tyres exploded, a shard of lightning slicing up from the floor into the ceiling, hard enough to knock loose chunks of concrete. Still that shape came, looking like a bear, its legs made of long strips of metal, its huge bulky body half engine, half chassis, its face a twisted knot of licence plate, the Ford medallion where one eye might have been. It's not real. It's a trick of the light. It's something poisonous in the smoke. The creature slipped free, crunching to the ground, shaking itself like a wet dog and spraying sparks across the garage. Then it started to run on all 4s, its clumsy feet slipping, claws churning up concrete like the floor was made of butter. Marlowe had swung the gun up before he even knew what he was doing, wrenching at the triggers, both of them, as the creature loomed up before him. Nothing happened. The creature slammed into him as hard and as fast as a truck. He was thrown back, spinning, landing hard enough to knock away the last scraps of oxygen. He rolled onto his back, seeing the lumbering metal shape canter away into the smoke, heading towards a pillar, towards a silhouette that he could see there. And surely that had to be another hallucination, because even though Marlowe had no air left to give, the girl he saw there still managed to take his breath away. She was beautiful, despite the blood and bruises on her face. It was a hard kind of beauty, her brow folded into a frown, her lips a thin grim line, her eyes chips of flint, utterly focused, like she was ready to headbutt her way through a stone wall and not give a damn about the consequences. Oh, are you serious? Focus! He shook his head. The girl was carrying an old-fashioned wooden weapon, a crossbow, but she was obviously hurt bad because she was struggling to lift it. A bone jutted from a broken leg. The guy with the shotgun was advancing, firing shot after shot, but the truck thing was relentless, crunching forwards, heading right for the girl. It reached out for her with a long metal limb, curling it around her chest, lifting her up. She screamed, the crossbow falling from her hand. Marlowe pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain as he searched the floor for his gun. By the time he picked it up, the creature had raised another limb, this one tipped with a wicked shard of steel. He still didn't know who the good guys were, but out of a guy and a girl and a monster, he figured the odds had to be on his side. He sprinted towards them, this time remembering to slide off the safety catch. He reached the girl at the same time as the man in black. The guy flicked him a glance, his face half scar and half grimace. Then he lifted his weapon and fired. They were 10 feet away from the creature, and the blast from the man's shotgun was so fierce that it made its metal flesh ripple. Marlowe gritted his teeth, pulled both triggers on his own gun. It barked, bucking hard enough to rip itself free of his fingers. A bolt of pain licked up his shoulder into his neck, making him cry out. The creature didn't react, bringing its limb back like a scorpion tail, the girl hanging before it, kicking pathetically. "Pan!" the man cried, pumping the mag, firing again. He threw the weapon aside and leaped, grabbing the creature around the neck, trying to wrench it away. Maybe 200 pounds of flesh against half a ton of metal. It didn't end well, the creature lashing out with another of its metal limbs and sending him spinning away. The man slid across the floor, groaning wetly, lying still. Marlowe scrabbled for his gun, working shells from his pocket, dropping them, panicking, unable to breathe, the air too thick. The darkness that was creeping into his vision had nothing to do with the smoke. "Go on then," he heard the girl say, her words choked with anger. "Do your worst." A scream, maybe human, maybe not, so full of violent glee that Marlowe fell on his ass. He looked up, saw the creature's limb flick back, then dart forward. It punched through the very centre of the girl's chest, right through her heart, appearing from her back in an eruption of blood and bone. Her face knotted up in agony and defiance, her teeth gritted like she was trying to hold back death with sheer force of will. Then everything went slack, her legs dangling, her arms slapping against her sides, her face falling like meat sliding off the bone. Her eyes were the last, flicking away from the creature, finding Marlowe, holding him for an instant that could have been an eternity. He couldn't move, couldn't have drawn a breath, even if he'd been physically able to. He just sat there on the warm concrete, the heat of the fire on his skin, until the last trickle of life drained away and her gaze moved off towards some distant horizon, some place that only the dead could see. No. There was still time to save her. He grabbed the gun, snapping it open and ejecting the used shells. The creature slid its limb free from the girl, flicking it hard enough to spray blood into the fire, sending jets of pink steam into the air. Marlowe jammed shells into the barrels, cranked the gun shut, walked right up behind it and pulled one trigger. This time he kept a solid hold, bracing the stock against his shoulder, shifting his weight against the recoil. The force of the explosion shattered the back of the creature's head, scattering lethal shrapnel. It dropped the girl, turning. Marlowe didn't wait. He just pulled the second trigger, ripping another chunk of metal away from the creature's body. It staggered, weakening, its metal limbs squealing as it flailed. Marlowe retreated, reloading, each attempt at a breath like he was trying to lift a dead weight off his chest. He clawed them in, his wheezes even louder than the roar of the fire, even louder than the crunch of the beast's feet as it advanced. He shunted 2 more shells into the holes, held his ground until the creature was close enough to touch. Then he pulled both triggers, blowing a hole right through the centre of the thing. It stood still for a moment, as if trying to figure out what was wrong, before collapsing. Marlowe reached for his pockets, the world suddenly spinning, not enough oxygen. He reeled, glancing off a pillar, dropping like a ton weight. And it hit him just as hard, the knowledge that he was going to die in here. He tried to breathe, his windpipe no wider than a hair, refusing to let anything in or out. Kicking at the ground, grasping at his pockets, finding his inhaler and bringing it to his lips. Where was the damn end of it? Something loomed up in front of him, the truck beast with its ragged wound of cables and splinters. There was another shape to the side, Marlowe's vision so blurred that he could almost convince himself that what he saw there wasn't a living creature made of concrete, its mouth a jagged saw-toothed scar across its body, big enough to swallow him whole. They closed in, smelling his fear, his blood. He sucked on the inhaler, pressing randomly, nothing. Lifting it, he saw that it was a shotgun shell. And his heart seemed to give up alongside his lungs. He wheezed, not even enough air for a cough, his hand slapping down to the floor. At least the asthma would get him first. Better to suffocate than to be torn to pieces by whatever the hell those things were. They prowled towards him, almost lazily, their eyeless faces somehow burning right into the very core of his soul. Close enough now that he could see the way the metal bent like plastic when they moved, concrete as malleable as Play-Doh, but still hard enough to crush his bones to powder. The rock-like one reared up, that vast maw opening. "Thought you'd finish with me, did you?" said a voice. There was a soft twang and a metal bolt ploughed into the neck stump of the truck beast. There was a blazing wave of light and a booming explosion like a concussion grenade, and the creature was reduced to a mound of rubble. What stood behind it was surely impossible. The girl's chest was caved in, firelight visible through the gaping hole where her heart should have been. Even now, though, the wound seemed to be closing, flesh knitting back together. The ugly tears on her arms and neck and face were sealing too, as if time was going backwards, white smoke drifting up from her skin. She was gritting her teeth against it, the pain etched into every line of her face, every jutting tendon in her neck. The concrete creature saw her and uttered a noise that could have been a building collapsing, a feral, industrial roar. It bounded past, running right for her. And over the thunder of its feet, Marlowe heard the girl say, "I'm whole. End the contract." The beast pounced, so heavy that Marlowe felt a tremor as it left the ground. The girl just stood there, empty crossbow by her side, those dark eyes never blinking. Then, like it hit some kind of invisible wall, the creature dropped, landing with a crunch, exploding into dust. It twitched once, then lay still. The truck thing simply froze. There was another metallic bang from the other side of the garage, Marlowe squinting to see a figure formed from a fire door in a section of wall fall over like a felled tree. Then there was silence, other than the subdued whisper of the flames and Marlowe's desperate, choking breaths. He almost had time to feel relieved before he remembered he was still dying. He clutched at his throat with one hand, slapping his empty pockets with the other, his back arching. The girl scanned the parking lot, a look of bored contempt on her perfect face. Only then did she look at Marlowe, not a trace of gratitude or kindness in those perfect features. Her injuries had stopped healing, some of the nicks and scrapes still dripping blood, but there was no sign of the puncture wound in her chest, other than a thick, leathery scar. Her uniform, though, had been unable to repair itself. It flapped open, revealing a black bra underneath. Not such a bad way to go, his brain told him, and for once in his life he had to agree. The girl noticed where he was looking, but made no effort to cover up. She just opened her mouth and spoke. "Done?" Marlowe couldn't have answered, even if he'd known what she was asking. His lungs were completely empty. There may as well have been a tank parked on top of him. He tried to shape his mouth around the word inhaler, tried to jab a finger at his throat, screaming inside his head, "Please find it for me. Get help." "You cut that one too close last time," she said, and he realised she was talking to somebody else. "We lost Forrest. And Herc." "Not quite," said another voice. Marlowe saw the man he'd been fighting alongside earlier, walking over, barely an inch of skin not drenched in blood and smeared with filth. He stood stooped next to the girl, panting, but she didn't even acknowledge his presence. They both looked at Marlowe. "None," the girl said in answer to some unheard question. "No other survivors." The man glanced at her. "What about him?" "What about him?" she replied, her voice the coldest thing Marlowe had ever heard. "Saved your life?" "No, he didn't. The contract did. Remember the rules, Herc. Nobody knows." Marlowe could no longer hold his eyes open, and he fell into darkness. He could almost hear his lungs screaming, the loudest thing in the world. Squirming on the floor. It was a coward's way out. "Hellraisers don't grow on trees, he heard the man say. "We need more engineers. He can fight. Look at him. He can't even breathe." "Pan." Marlowe made out the scuffing of feet, the sound of somebody walking away. "Pan!" And that was it. One last squeaking, pathetic, airless breath. Marlowe wished his last thought could have been of his mum, of his brother, of the things he loved. Instead, the very last bubble of oxygen he would ever breathe was expended, wishing he could tell a girl whose life he'd just saved to go screw herself. And yeah, I've got time for one more. This chapter is called Ice Queen. Pan! Pan turned away, partly so she could scan for an exit, partly so Herc wouldn't see her face. It was taking every ounce of strength she had to stay upright, her body a broken engine on the verge of stalling. Everything hurt. Everything, especially her chest, although hurt was the wrong word. It wasn't pain so much as a grinding, awful sense that this time she'd gone too far. Her heart pulsed weak and wet, and the vertebrae in her spine scraped together. There was a trapped nerve in there, and it felt like somebody jabbing her repeatedly with a scalpel. She wasn't taking in enough air because one of her lungs hadn't fully reinflated. Her contract had worked, but only barely. A few more seconds maybe, and they'd have had her. The underground parking lot was hell on earth, literally. The scattered remains of the demons lay beside the corpse of the driver, identical only in their absence of life. The truth was, he didn't know how lucky he was to be dead, to be cold. Excuse me. He didn't know how lucky he was to be dead, to be cold. There were far worse places the living could go when their hearts stopped beating and their bodies started cooling. She'd almost found out exactly how bad those places were. No time for that. No time for what-ifs. There would be a SWAT team down here soon, and she didn't want to be around when they started firing bullets or questions at her. She couldn't take the exit ramp. The whole world would be watching by now. But there was an access door in the far wall. Half a door anyway, with a demon-shaped hole in one side where something had pulled loose. It hung off its hinges, swinging in the currents of heat that circled the parking lot, beckoning her like a finger. The earpiece was history, and she plucked it out, chucking it. She walked towards the door, going as fast as the wreck of her body would let her. The molten heat of the adrenaline was cooling into solid metal in her limbs, weighing her down, the reality of the situation bleeding back in. Had she died back there? She rubbed the scar on her chest, the mottled skin completely numb. The thought frightened her. It terrified her. Because for an instant, when the demon's blade cut through her heart, she'd felt the world dissolve, felt something take hold of her soul, wrench her down through the fabric of reality into whatever waited for her below. Only an instant. Then the contract had kicked in. But it had been close. It always was when you traded for the big one, when you traded for an invulnerability. She stepped over the dead driver, her foot almost slipping in a puddle of blood. She didn't even know his name, even though he'd been working with them for weeks, even though she'd shared a Wendy's breakfast sandwich with him that very morning. Not a man, not a human, just a corpse. It was all he ever was. And better to think of it that way, better to stay cold than to burn in the fire of regret and guilt and shame. Forrest, though, he was different. Not a driver, not a bodyguard like Herc. He'd been an engineer, the same as her. She could still see him being dragged into the molten ground, screaming even though his head had been obliterated. She could still hear him. She would hear him for the rest of her life, him and all the others, just one more name in the book of dead engineers. Sorry, she said, then regretted it. It wasn't her fault. He'd known what the risks were when he'd made the deal. He'd known the price he would have to pay. If she took responsibility for him, then she'd have to take responsibility for the rest of them, and then she'd be buried by guilt, her soul as tormented as theirs. Ostheim should never have let them get so close to the end of the contract, though. This was his fault. Behind her, she heard shuffling, a grunt, a pathetic wheeze, and she didn't have to look back to know what was going on. She did anyway. If only to scowl at Herc as he lifted a hunk of plastic between his fingers, inserted it into the kid's mouth, an inhaler. He pressed it a few times, massaging the boy's chest. Then he hefted the unconscious body over one shoulder. He fired a look right back at her, one that said, "What are you going to do about it?" He was right. They needed engineers. They needed them all the time, the way a butcher needs a yard full of chickens. The kid, he'd appeared out of nowhere, had maybe distracted one of the demons long enough to let her ruined flesh knit itself back together. But he was still just a boy, and a dying one at that. If his pitiful breathing was anything to go by. But that was always Herc's problem. His big, stupid, bleeding heart. Pan reached the door, pushed through into a concrete stairwell, a haze of smoke making her eyes water. There was a choice of up or down, but the thought of heading even deeper beneath the earth after what she'd just felt made her stomach want to explode out of her mouth. She headed up, running for a couple of steps before her battered heart slowed her to a walk. Place should be big enough to make us invisible, growled Herc behind her. Cops will be setting up a perimeter outside, but we should pass as civvies. He coughed. You might want to lose the crossbow, though. Yeah? She doubled around the bend, snatching in breaths as she continued up. I lose the bow, you lose some teeth. Just saying, he replied. Nothing quite says crazy like a big-ass 17th century weapon hanging off your back. She ignored him, reaching the door to the ground level. There was an alarm going off, she realised, and she could hear footsteps and screams from the other side. A stampede. Perfect. She opened the door a crack, peeking past to see a corridor, people flowing out of wards, bare feet slapping on the floor. A few orderlies and security guards were doing their best to herd them towards the back of the hospital. Herc was right. The bow was a little conspicuous, but there weren't more than a dozen of these things in existence, and Ostheim only owned 3. She grabbed the collar of her tattered Kevlar shirt and pulled, the Velcro tearing. Shrugging it off, she wrapped it tightly around the bow, leaning on it like it was a walking stick and standing there in nothing but her bra. Well, that'll take their minds off the crossbow if nothing else, said Herc, his eyes scrolling over every inch of the stairwell except her, even past the blood and dirt she could see him blush. Perv, she said, pushing through the door into the crowd. It didn't take one of the guards long to pick her out, his eyes widening as he executed the perfect double take. She didn't need much help, looking like a patient, coughing violently as she was swept along with the tide. Another guard was standing at the end of the corridor, ushering everyone to the left. Pan used her crossbow to hold herself up, limping around the corner to see a big double door up ahead, splashed with sunlight. The sight of it almost brought tears to her eyes. Probably would have done if the heat of the fire hadn't singed her tear ducts shut. There was a line of cops outside, beady eyes assessing everyone who left the building. Pan did her best to look the way normal people probably looked when they saw death, her face crumpling, her hand covering her eyes, her shoulders lurching like she'd broken down into sobs. It wasn't exactly an Oscar-worthy display, but it must have done the trick because they waved her on towards a posse of waiting ambulances and first responders. Pan ducked between 2 trees at the side of the road, hopping over a low metal fence onto the street beyond. There was a rustle of leaves and Herc appeared, trying to manoeuvre himself over the iron spikes, the boy still slung over his shoulder. Little help, he said. He's your new boyfriend, Pan replied. You love him so much, you carry him. Oh, do you always have to be such an icy bitch? He stumbled, almost fell, clutching the kid like a sack of potatoes. A couple of teenage boys walked past holding skateboards, both of them ogling her, oblivious to everything except for what she looked like. She pulled the shirt off her crossbow, gave them something else to ogle, sent them skittering. They were on a side road, a couple of cars parked next to the curb. They weren't exactly flash, but they'd do. She made for the closest one, used the butt of the crossbow to shatter the driver's side window. Do you always have to be such a miserable old git? She replied, as she popped the lock, the central locking clunking. Do you always need 30 seconds to come up with a riposte? Herc opened the rear door, sliding the kid inside. Pan waited until the big guy had straightened before shaking her head at him. That's a lot of effort for a skinny kid, she said. You should have left him up there with the paramedics. Saved yourself some bother. He's seen us, Pan. He's seen them. Can't take the chance. Can't take the chance he wouldn't talk. We should have left him to die then, she offered. Not like he'd be the first. Hell, we've lost 12 engineers in as many months. What's one more corpse for the cleaners to bag up? This time, Herc's eyes narrowed, his face turning to stone. He didn't reply. He just stared at her. If looks could kill and all that. She had to turn away, her own cheeks heating, suddenly ashamed. She hissed out a humourless laugh to cover it. I'm glad you find this so funny, Pan, Herc said, pushing past her, his disgust oozing off him in waves. He folded his body into the driver's seat, slammed the door and started ripping out wires from the dash. She stood there a moment longer, chewing on the stew of emotion that bubbled up from her stomach, wanting to punch Herc in the face, wanting to scream her lungs out at the sky, wanting to curl up beneath the car and cry and cry and cry. And it was only because she couldn't work out which of those feelings scared her more that she walked robotically to the other side, opened the creaking door and clambered in. Herc fired up the engine, revved it. You had to pick a goddamned Honda, she said, and it was almost an apology. Come on, we need to get hold of Ostheim before he sends the whole pigeon's nest down here looking for you. Pan didn't answer. She just stared out of the windshield, watching the world start to roll past, happy to be cold, to be hard, and to be made of ice. Do we have time for one more? Yeah, why not? One more. And this is called Call Them Choices. He's coming around. Marlowe rose from a dream of demons and dead things, clinging to the voices like they were a life raft. He wrenched open his eyes, felt like he'd been punched in the brain by the bright white light, screwed them closed again. When he took a breath, he heard the familiar rattle and clank of his lungs. He eased his eyes open again, seeing blurred shapes there, 2 of them. He tried to sit up but found that he was in a narrow hospital bed, rows of thin plastic straps holding him tight. He was almost angry until he remembered his last thought, that he was never going to wake up again. "What the hell?" he said, his mouth dry, his tongue getting stuck to his teeth. He blinked the 2 figures into focus. One was the big guy from the parking lot, cleaned up out now but still covered in bruises, grazes, burns and scars. He was sitting on a metal chair to the side of the bed, and when he heard Marlowe speak, he looked up, running a hand through what was left of his grey hair. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're back. Wasn't sure you were going to make it for a while there. How's he doing?" "Good," said the other figure, stepping up to the man's shoulder. She was a woman in a red overcoat, in her 50s maybe, white blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She held a clipboard in her hand, 1 page lifted. "Couple of lumps and bumps." She let the paper drop, looked at Marlowe with an easy smile. "Nothing that won't heal." Maybe I'll heal a little quicker if you loosen these up a bit," he replied, struggling to lift his arms. "Just a precaution," said the man. He seemed to chew on the words. "You said a few things back there. You saw a few things back there. Things we don't really want you sharing. Creatures made of rock, concrete, metal, dead flesh. A girl who died, who had a hole punched through her heart. A girl who came back." Marlowe looked past the man and woman, seeing a huge room, easily 100 feet each way. There were windows on all 4 sides, flooding the space with sunlight. He squinted, trying to see anything through the golden haze. Was that the Chrysler out there? The man followed his gaze, then shared a look with the woman that Marlowe couldn't quite place. She nodded and walked away into the giant space. There were other people there, just a handful milling between various stacks of boxes and complicated-looking pieces of equipment. One thing in particular caught his eye, something that looked like one of those huge machines they used in hospitals, like a giant tube you slid into, an MRI scanner or something, emitting a loud hum. It was on the other side of the room, but he could make out a pair of legs stretched from it, toes flexing. Was that a scar on the shin? He remembered an injury, bone sticking through the flesh, and his heart flipped like a pancake when he realised who was in it. This time, when the man saw where he was staring, he grinned. Just about the most terrifying grin Marlowe had ever seen, with his lips chapped and burned and one of his upper front teeth missing. "Kid, don't even go there." "Who is she?" Marlowe said, breathless again. The machine was spitting out light as it did whatever it was supposed to do, but those bare legs still stretched into darkness. "Her name's Pan," said the man. "Pan?" Marlowe craned his neck up, trying to get a better look. "What kind of a name is that?" "Pandora," he went on. "Best you don't ask why. I'm Herc." "Herc?" Marlowe managed to tear his eye off those legs, and he looked at the man. "What kind of a name is that? Short for Hercules?" "Not quite. Herman Cole. Got called Herc one day when I started here, by mistake. Kind of stuck." "Here," said Marlowe, chewing on the word. "It's a hospital, right?" It had to be, didn't it? With this bed and all the equipment. That explained a lot. Explained why he'd imagined the world coming to life and trying to murder him. Explained why he'd seen somebody return from the dead. He stretched his mind back, trying to put the chaos of his memories in some kind of order. The school, the store. "It's all real, before you ask what you saw. I'd love to tell you otherwise, but that would make me a liar. And say one thing for me, I'm not that." "Real?" Marlowe shook his head. "No way," he said. "No way." As if repeating it might make it true. He tugged at the straps, grunting with frustration, his mouth drier than ever. "Do you think I could get something to drink?" "In a minute," said Herc. The big man winced, his injuries obviously painful. "Got some choices to talk over first." "Choices?" Marlowe frowned. He didn't like the expression on the man's face. "I'll keep it simple. What you saw back there was never meant to be seen, not by you. We have a protocol here. The first law, the world cannot know. Know what? Marlowe said, feeling the panic start to claw into his lungs, the asthma around his throat. He coughed again, wheezing as he drew breath, trying to work out where his inhaler would be. Well, that's the problem, ain't it? Herc said. I can't tell you because then you'll know. Why don't you start with what you think you saw? Marlowe frowned, his mind slipping back into the fire, into the chaos. Those things, he said, what were they? And too late he figured he should have said, oh, I didn't see anything. Everything's a blank. Was I in a car accident? I mean, I don't remember, he stuttered. Nice try. Herc sat back, sighed, the chair creaking under his bulk. Okay, so you saw them. That limits what choices you get, and they were a limited bunch of choices anyway. Pick door number 1, you come work for us. Work for you? As what? An engineer, Herc said, grunting when he saw Marlowe's expression. Is a soldier, really, of sorts. Good work, great pay. We look after your family too. When you die. He didn't need to say it. It was right there in the way his eyes never left the floor. I'll pass, thanks, Marlowe said. Whatever you guys are into, you're welcome to it. I don't want any part of it. The hum of the MRI machine faded, making the room seem deathly quiet. Marlowe looked over as the tray slid free from the machine. Pan rolled off, as graceful as water, her hands fluffing up her short hair. There was still a scar over her heart, but it looked ancient now, like it had healed years ago. She caught him staring and scowled, snatching up a dressing gown and marching behind a curtain. You sure? Herc said, reminding Marlowe that he and Pan weren't the only 2 people in the world. She's behind door number 1. I thought you just said don't go there. I'm just saying, Herc said. There are other perks too. Yeah, like what? Like anything you want, Herc said with another gruesome smile. Literally anything. Marlowe shook his head, trying to shuffle his thoughts into some kind of order. He snatched in a breath, caught the stench of smoke wafting off Herc, and suddenly he was right there again, in the heat of it, his lungs full of fire and burning flesh. He closed his eyes, and all he could see was the world tearing itself apart, a creature made of concrete and metal rearing above him, ready to stamp him into mud. No, he said, before he even knew he was talking. No way. Door number 2. I'll take it. Door number 2, said Herc, almost sadly. Door number 2, and you'll never know. Door number 2, and you'll always wonder about what happened. That's the thing about secrets. They're like a hole in your life. Yeah, better a hole in my life than a hole in my heart. He shrugged his arms beneath the straps, waiting for Herc to release him. Herc showed no sign of moving, though. You fought well, kid. Came out of nowhere, shotgun blazing. What were you doing down there anyway? Pretty heroic. Ha! Marlowe grinned without humour. Yeah, real heroic. Taking a gun to save himself, trying to run away. The only reason he'd been down there was because the cops had herded him that way. Yeah, Marlowe Green, real hero. Just thought I could help, was what he said, staring at the ceiling. Well, Herc said, that's a rare thing, kid. And you saved our asses in there, whatever she might say. Marlowe glanced over to the curtain, disappointed that Pan was still out of sight. He took the time to chew on Herc's words. A soldier. Like Danny. So he could be dead, like Danny. But there was something about these guys, something that tugged at him. Who are you, anyway? Need to know, Herc replied, tapping the side of his nose with one finger. Pick that first door and you get to find out. There was an itch inside his skull. The need to know. After all, it wasn't every day that everything you thought you knew about the world turned out to be a lie. No. Better to forget. Better to run. It's what he did best. Look, he said, it was just a fluke. I wasn't thinking. If I could do it all again, I'd have run the other way, okay? Just get me the hell out of these things and let me go. Let you go, said Herc. Yeah, door number 2. I just want to go home. Herc shook his head. Sorry, kid. If only it were that simple. Door number 2 is, like I said, you've seen things. Things the world can't know. Marlowe let his head crash down onto the pillow. Herc didn't have to say any more. It was pretty clear what he was driving at. So door number 1, I join you, fight those things, probably get my head ripped off. Door number 2, I never leave this building. Right? Herc shrugged. And Marlowe swore beneath his breath. And you call them choices? Okay, we'll leave it there. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Tomorrow, next chapter, you gotta laugh. So Marlowe has made his choice. He doesn't want no part of this, and I don't blame him. I mean, those demons are pretty horrific. I really enjoyed writing that scene. That was the scene that I first had in my head when I started thinking about this book, this underground parking lot, and demons literally ripping themselves from the walls, made up of concrete and bits of car, anything that isn't living. Because usually demons possess the living, but these demons are the opposite of this. They possess anything that isn't alive, any kind of not inorganic, but any non-alive tissue, I guess, substance. I don't know, but yeah. So that is them. Yeah, and we'll see plenty more of them later on. I hope you enjoyed. It was really lovely being here with you today, and I'll try and come back tomorrow and get another few chapters read. Anyway, whatever you're doing today, I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, I will see you soon. Okay, bye.